Good evening and welcome. This is a meeting of the Special Education Advisory Committee of the Halton District School Board for Tuesday, the 14th of May, 2024, rescheduled from May 7th, 2024. In accordance with Ontario Regulation 463-97 and guidelines effective February the 1st, 2021, HDSB promotes community engagement and participation by having processes in place for members of the public to ask questions. A Google form was attached to the agenda, distributed in advance of the meeting, and is also posted on the HDSB SEAC website page. Questions posed during live-streamed meetings of SEAC may be answered during the meeting, particularly those related to agenda items, or at the following meeting at the discretion of the chair. For efficiency, multiple questions received that are similar in nature may be grouped together at the discretion of the chair and/or vice chair. Questions will not be attributed. Notation will be made that multiple people ask the same question. Any questions that contain language that is hateful or discriminatory will not be considered. So first of all, we're going to start with a roll call to record who's in attendance. Please answer yes or present. Kate Lambacher.
Present.
Sarika Kanifi.
Present.
Great. Amanda Winch.
Here.
Jennifer Laguerre.
Present.
Alison Brindle, I'm here. Nadina Torrick.
Present.
Evelyn Bursey.
Present.
We have regrets from Angel. Melissa Dockery. Sarah Lansley. Sophia Siddiqui.
Present.
Erin Ruppel.
Present.
Erin Sproul.
Present.
Kaiser Klassen.
Present.
Katie Schleifer.
Present.
Naveed Ahmed.
Good evening, everyone.
Carol Baxter.
Present.
And Jin Yi Zhang.
Evening.
Great. We also have Colette Ruddock.
Good evening.
Roxana Nagoy. Jay Chanthaban. Conan Spruan. Kevin and Claire Sheffield. Okay, thank you. We have quorum tonight, so we will continue. First of all, we'll begin by honouring the land. Halton, as we know it today, is rich in history and modern traditions of many First Nations and the Métis. From the Anishinaabe to the Atawonderan, the Haudenosaunee and the Métis, these lands surrounding the Great Lakes are steeped in Indigenous history. As we gather today on these treaty lands, we have the responsibility to honour and respect the four directions, land, waters, plants, animals, ancestors that walked before us, and all the wonderful elements of creation that exist. We would like to acknowledge and thank the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation for sharing their traditional territory with us. So first of all, we're going to approve the agenda for tonight's meeting. Are there any modifications or amendments that anybody would like to make to the agenda? None being seen, would somebody like to motion to approve the agenda?
I will. Katie Schleifer.
Okay, we have Katie to approve. Kaiser, do you want to second? Kaiser will second. Anybody who does not approve the passing of the agenda, if you could make yourselves known. None being seen, the agenda is approved as standing. Next, we have the approval of our April the 2nd, 2024 meeting minutes. Are there any errors or omissions? Would someone like to move a motion to approve the minutes? Amanda, thank you. And would anybody like to second? Jennifer, thank you very much. Is there any opposition to the minutes as recorded? If so, could you please indicate now? None being seen, the minutes for April the 2nd, 2024 are approved unanimously. So now we're going to move on to our action items. It's a busy evening with lots of great information. So first of all, I'd like to welcome Superintendent Ngoy to present on the budget for the 2024-2025 school year. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm just going to share the slides. 1 second. So I cannot see the screen. Can you see the presentation?
Not yet. We can now.
Okay. I am not sure if I'm presenting because I'm presenting a presentation.
You're not in presenter mode. We're just seeing the individual, the slides at the moment.
All right. One second. Let's try this again. All right.
That's great.
All right. So good evening, everyone, and thank you for having us this evening. Jay Chantapang, the General Manager of Financial Services, is also online, and we will be taking turns walking you through a few slides. Feel free to ask questions as we go through the slides, as well as towards the end of the presentation. So we'll give you an update on the budget development process, the enrollment, revenue, and expenses. Walk you through some of the budget pressures and next steps in terms of finalizing the draft budget. The numbers that you'll see here are preliminary. We are just putting them through the system, and we're going to be presenting the very first draft of the budget to the Committee of the Whole, the Board of Trustees at the Committee of the Whole meeting on May 22nd next week. So things are still evolving. Quickly, just in terms of the timelines, what we have here, we started back in December in terms of budget planning and timelines, and have done a number of presentations to the Board of Trustees and to SEAC earlier in January. And we are going to the Committee of the Whole next week and twice to the board in terms of a draft report and a final report for approval on June 19th. So we're towards the end of the budget process. This particular year, we are having a difficult task to balance the budget as a result of regulatory requirements that are now in effect and require a school board that has had a deficit for 2 years in a row to balance their budget the third year, even if they have accumulated surplus or reserves that could be used to complement the budget. So in the current year, 2023-2024, we do have a structural deficit of 7.7 million, which needs to be eliminated. And in addition to that, there's other factors that have to be taken into account. If there's any changes in our revenue, which we'll talk in the next few slides, declining enrollment, decline in interest rates, which will reduce our interest revenue, and so forth. So there's many areas that are factors that are informing the requirement for reductions in the budget for next year. As a result, the senior team and the Board of Trustees have been working since, I would say, September, October. We started discussions in terms of finding as many efficiency as we could before we went into further reductions considerations. Like any other year, there are areas that we are looking at adding into the budget as well. So that means there has to be sufficient rooms and resources to allow for additions. So we took all of that into account when we are looking at next year's budget and how are we able to balance I just have a note on this slide. It's preliminary. The numbers are preliminary. We may require additional changes. So from what you see today to what goes next week to the Board of Trustees and the approval, there might be some differences. Provincially, I just wanted to highlight a few things. So the grants for student needs, or the GSN as we were accustomed to in terms of the funding from province for school boards, they have changed. They are now called Core Education Funding, or Core Ed for short. There's also some other changes in terms of terminology. You have probably heard us talking about one-time investments, which we called Priorities and Partnership Funds, or PPFs. They are now called Responsive Education Funding, or REPs. And also they separated from that funding to external partners, which are called FEP or FEPs. So different terminology as we go forward. The funding formula has been reallocated and streamlined into 6 main allocations. So it is a little bit more user-friendly and easier for the public to follow, and hopefully from an accountability perspective, easier to follow our reporting. Provincially, we are the second largest component for the education sector. The funding is $28.6 billion, plus an additional just over $400 million in these responsive education funding and funding for external partnerships, which are one-time in nature. There are, however, some changes from last year. For example, the responsive education funding support mainly the same, but they do not continue the streaming supports. They do, however, have some additional funding as it relates to targeted literacy, numeracy, STEM, mental health, and special education transitions. There has only been an increase in the operating or non-salary components for school facilities or school operations, but there hasn't been an increase in the other areas such as technology, school resources, school supplies. So that certainly is continuing to put pressure on the operating budget of school boards. Central labor negotiations are expected to be finalized with the final compensation components in June. But what we do know is that all what we are waiting for in terms of the support for student funds, or the SSF funding, that is tied to collective agreement and provide funding for additional resources to various employee groups, they have been now finalized. And all of our groups are receiving it, with the exception of the education workers for clerical and administrative staff. So that is reflected in here, and there's quite a number of resources, professional, paraprofessional, educational assistants that are attached to this funding. So we're glad to see that this is continuing. As well, transportation funding, there are increases from the current year for about 3%, but when we compare to the old funding formula, we actually get less funding than we did in 22-23. So we're taking it with a grain of salt. From a board perspective, we are looking at an enrollment decline next year. So there's both, between both elementary and secondary panels, we're looking at about 271 enrollment decline year over year. And we still have pressures from a perspective of supply. Staffing costs are not funded at the same level that our costs are, and that is a provincial pressure. And the increasing to, or the enhancement to statutory benefits for CPP and EI remain unfunded. So those are our main challenges in terms of funding by far. There has been some one-time funding investments in special education and mental health, and they are reflected in the funding envelope as we go through the next few slides. I will pass it on to Jay to walk you through the next few slides, and we'll start with enrollment changes.
All right, so thanks, Roxana. So yeah, I'll go through enrollment, revenues, and expenses before passing it back to Roxana. So Our enrollment projection for next year is expected to be about 66 average daily enrollment, or ADE for short. Now, this is a decrease compared to our current year's revised estimates of almost 271 ADE, or a decrease of 801 ADE from our original estimates at this time last year. So either way, a decrease of either 0.4% or almost 1.2%, depending on which comparison you're using. This is the main driver to our revenues, which will be on the next couple slides. So the first slide here is just a pie chart, just showing kind of the slices of different pieces of revenue for us. So the largest one in dark blue there being our provincial grants, or the core ed funding, so to the tune of about 86.5%. And then some of the smaller slices are the green there for other fees and revenues, the red there for amortization of deferred capital contributions, and school general funds is the teal colored slice, 2.1%, and then the other two smaller ones being investment income and other provincial grants. So the next table kind of puts this into dollar format. So starting off the top here, our core education funding is expected to be about $829 million for next year, compared to our current year of almost $790 million. So about a $40 million increase. Now, the footnote at the bottom here, footnote number 1, kind of explains the vast majority of the increase year over year, being 3 years of labor provision built in, as well as the Bill 124 remedy has been added in the revenue budget for next year. So those are the two main drivers year over year. The other large variances, one being the provincial grants other. So these are our PPFs, or they will be known next year as the REPs, as Roxana mentioned. So they are going down by almost 4.2 million. The largest one being the REP funding for de-streaming supports. So that is discontinuing for next year. The other large change year over year is in the other fees and revenue line, about 43 million. Now, the largest component of that increase is our education development charge that we collect from property development. So that is out of compliance. We can't use it to balance our budget, so it's considered out of compliance revenue. So that's the vast majority of that amount. So all in all, 80 million increase year over year for revenues. So moving on to the next slide, just some key highlights that we picked out, again, comparing year over year, listed out here. I won't go through them all, but essentially the idea is the first one there is increase to benchmarks, as mentioned, in the core ed funding, for as well as funding formula updates and the implementation of 2021 census data, as well as any new allocations that were added by the ministry. There was also one PPF for professional assessments that was transferred to the core ed funding, which is great because then we can rely on that year over year going forward. However, on the flip side, the fourth point there was a few allocations that were either going to be discontinued or were reduced by the ministry. And then a couple points down, I mentioned the de-streaming of 3.3 million being discontinued, and then the next point there, EDC charges being the large majority of the other revenue. So moving on to the next couple slides. So it's just to highlight the special education fund within the core ed funding model. So the core ed funding model did go through a restructure, and the special education fund was also restructured within itself. So some renaming, as well as some groupings of different allocations that were in the GSN prior. So now the four main components are the special education fund per pupil allocation, the differentiated needs allocation, complex supports allocation, and specialized equipment allocation. So all in all, the allocations haven't changed much. They're just kind of regrouped for different purposes, for reporting purposes, for enveloping purposes, and whatnot. The provision to envelope special education funding hasn't changed much, although it has opened up some flexibility with the CF funding in particular. We have more flexibility with that. So just the last point there, year over year, special education fund is an increase of almost $3 million compared to last year, mostly as a result of benchmark increases, formula changes, and the addition of the professional assessments PPF that I mentioned. So on the next slide, just to touch on some other areas of core ed funding that help support special education fund, the Learning Resource Fund, cost adjustment and qualifications grants, student transportation, support for students, and school board administration fund. So this next slide kind of looks at the special education fund in more detail. So the different allocations I just mentioned a few minutes ago are laid out here and compared year over year to our current year's revised estimates. So every allocation has gone up, as mentioned, due to benchmark increases and new allocations that might have been added within any of these lines.
Okay, can I just interrupt you there? I think Kate had a question. Kate Lambacher?
I do. So I see that the self-contained adjustment has gone up, but I also see that we're losing 27 full-time equivalent staffing for self-contained classrooms, and I am having a lot of difficulty understanding how those two things reconcile.
And that's a great question. The important part to understand in terms of the $2.8 million increase is that most of that is related to compensation. So it's almost like a flow through as opposed to a net new money that can be allocated to other things. The other portion is that there has been, when we're looking at the envelope, an overspending in the special education and student well-being envelope as well. So although the funding has gone up, that does not mean that it's additional net new money. So there are pressures for the school board. Having said that, the changes to self-contained classes and program viability did not have the budget reduction or pressures in mind, but mostly was a holistic view of the programming itself. The funding is for up to 16 students per classroom, so anything underneath does create a budget pressure, and our school board did have quite a much lower class size. However, we were looking more from the perspective of still maintaining lower class sizes, but looking at program viability more than through the lens of reductions.
So we haven't been provided any details in this report about what this means in terms of program closure and availability. It's very generic, saying 27 FTE reduction. What does that actually mean in terms of program closure and classroom closure?
Now, I do believe that is on some of the next slides, so we're jumping a little bit ahead. I will also mention that, and we'll share the link in the comments to our board presentation on March 20th. There is actually some additional detail that we're providing in terms of what are the reductions, the thoughts behind them, and how we're going to integrate and support the system. So that might be of help to share as well. And I will pass it on to my colleague, Superintendent Ruddock, if she had additional comments at this time.
Yeah, thanks, Superintendent Nagoy. And SEAC might recall that last month at the April SEAC, I did go through each self-contained program that experienced an increase or decrease to classes or stability in the classes, and itemized each one of those. But we can review that when we get to that in the upcoming slides.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'll finish off the last little bit here and pass it off to Roxana. So yeah, year over year, special education fund is up 2.8 million, and then when we add in the other core ed funding areas, it comes into about a 10.4 million increase year over year. Now, it's also, a lot of it is, like Roxana said, a direct offset in terms of, compensation costs going up. So a lot of it is spoken for. So there's not, a lot of opportunity to add more supports as easily. So moving on to the next slide, just to touch on the expense side of things. So currently they're in the process of being finalized. So unfortunately, we're not able to share a lot of detailed figures tonight, but there will be a lot shared next week at Committee of the Whole. So just some highlights, and this list is not a lot of new items. It's the same stuff, the same reasons for expense changes year over year, whether it's increasing salaries and benefits due to regulatory requirements in terms of funded statutory benefits, or compensation increases due to central negotiations and whatnot. Supply staff costs are another budget pressure that's been increasing year over year, and the trend doesn't seem to be changing. And then inflationary type of costs going up for utilities, maintenance, cleaning, system implementations or fees, and so forth. So none of these items are new per se. So I think I'm handing it off to Roxana for the rest.
Thank you, Jay. So this is a proposed list of savings and efficiencies that was identified and presented to the Board of Trustees in March. And we're still working for finalizing these and providing a finalized draft next week to the board, but we wanted to share with the committee. So this is just providing you a little bit of information in terms of the proposed savings and efficiencies for next year, which include central teaching supports, mainly efficient class size staffing for elementary and secondary panels, and the program viability review and resizing within special education. There have been a change in the model for structured reading. There's a reduction of 8 positions here, but there's an addition on one of the slides that follows of 4 coaches and an instructional program lead to continue this work. And the behavioral resource class closures for next year. Within mental health and well-being, there are a reduction of 2 child and youth counselors, and the mental health strategy. There's been a little bit of funding provided in one-time rep funds to help alleviate some of this reduction, as well as we've looked at all the other areas within our budget for additional savings and reductions, and there's more compiled since this list. So that is a total of about 10.3 million in initial suggested savings and efficiencies for the following year. And in terms of proposed additions, so this one is revised from what the Board of Trustees received in March. This just shows a couple of additional reductions. And we're looking at 2 more psychologists positions, as we mentioned during the revenue review, there has been some money transferred from one-time professional assessments funding into the core education funding under special education. Gave us an opportunity to rely that this funding will continue year over year and be able to add to psychologists to help with the professional assessments and wait lists going forward. So that is a total addition of about 10 positions. That includes up above the special education instruction program lead for structured reading, as well as free coaches, as I mentioned before, with some additional supports for student funds that were tied to collective agreements. We were also able to add a specialized behavior support worker and a social worker. This is probably very difficult to see, but this is just an overview of the special education and student well-being staffing. Compare for next year's budget to the current year revised estimates. In here, there is also impact of a reallocation of GLE credit-bearing courses from being within the envelope of special education to moving out to the centralized HR sections that are being provided to secondary schools. So it's not a reduction overall for the school board, it's just moving it from special education to the central allocation for HR. Just in summary, our biggest budget pressure remain the funding that has not changed for supply costs or supply staffing costs. We are currently 10.1 million in a deficit position when we look at this funding. And looking back at pre-pandemic levels, the funding was 4 million shorter than our cost, and we are now 10 million over that funding. The statutory benefits for CPP and EI have a cumulative shortfall of 8.7 unfunded cost pressures and 1.4 million year over year of unfunded cost pressures. The facility costs are increasing in terms of the cost, inflation, utilities, maintenance, as well as portable leasing and placements. So which are well over the 1.6 million overall funding increase allocation, which also includes a component for staffing and compensation. The transportation allocation is still short in terms of where our costs are by about $1.5 million. And I mentioned before there were no changes in some of the non-salary benchmarks for technology, learning materials, and school supplies, so that the inflation, and that is looking back 15 years to 2009, actually, we did a comparison. Inflation is 41% since then, but yet we're funded at the same level. It just goes up with enrollment, but certainly we are seeing the pressure in maintaining our budgets and costs within that. And then special education and student well-being continue to exceed the funding envelope even after all the changes that we've talked, both in terms of savings and reallocating new funding by about preliminary for this for right now until all the costs go through the actual benchmarks. Right now there's a lot of estimating in our numbers, but the preliminary number is 4.5, and we actually have a breakdown of how that was decreased over the previous over 17 million in terms of a shortfall. So when we're looking at the enveloping, the main changes are one time we are able to use the deferred revenue for special education equipment, which was an envelope within an envelope, but is now all broad within the envelope for special education fund. As well as we brought in revenue, just allocated revenue for professionals and paraprofessional staff. Mainly, some are special education, some are under the student well-being, mental health and well-being. So we've brought in the proportion of revenue for almost 6 million that is under the classroom staffing support or the old pupil foundation support. So that is really it's not new money. is just a reallocation as it was showing outside of the envelope, just so that we match the supporting revenue outside in the other allocations with the costs that are being charged in this envelope. And the balance of about 6.1 million is the net between some of the staffing efficiencies, reductions, resizing, as well as the proposed additions that are special education, some reallocation of funding, and additional funding that has been added to the envelope. And about 2.5 million of that is the reallocation out of the special education of the credit-bearing sections for GLE courses that are now under secondary staffing component and not within this. So it doesn't impact this allocation, it's just moved out. And I thought I saw a hand, so maybe I'll pause there.
Yep. So
yes, thank you. That was me.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I did just have a question about the reallocation of the GLE credits. Where are they going when you say that they're going from the spec ed envelope to the general allocation? What is that going to look like?
And thank you for that question. So HR, under the secondary staffing model, works with every secondary school to provide them with the credit-bearing and non-credit-bearing student success sections. And in addition to that, these other sections were added on, but they were mapped to special education. So in order to be more efficient, HR now holds all the sections, including these sections, and will be assigning them to schools based on individual needs for next year. So it's still the same amount of resources and sections, is just being assigned through only one process in order to be able to see the big picture.
Okay, so that makes sense. But within a school, which department would they then be allocated to? Are they going to be allocated to a spec ed department? Would they be allocated to guidance? Who will be the oversight for each of those individual classes?
I can jump in to answer that, Jennifer. So that all of that, in terms of this school rollout, remains the same. So there are still sections. We in Halton combine our GLE and GLS sections together. And because we combine GLE, GLS together, it's always, it's a requirement that it's a teacher with special education qualifications that teaches the class. So technically falls under special education, even though there will be students in there who are taking the GLS credit, as well as the students taking the GLE. So all of that remains unchanged. It's just who is holding the sections to hand them out. It's human resources who hands out all of our credit-bearing sections.
Perfect. Thank you. I just wanted that as the clarification. Thank you. Now it makes sense.
And thank you for that question. That really summarizes how we got from a 17.7 million current deficit in the special education and student well-being envelope to an expected preliminary 4.5 million. So we just wanted to provide you with those main components. And I believe our last slide is just, as I mentioned before, finalizing our numbers for next week's presentation. And then with the input that we receive from the Board of Trustees, we would be putting together the board report for June 5th to be approved at the June 19th board meeting. And Jay and myself would be happy to take any other questions.
Are there any questions at this time? No. Okay. Well, I want to thank you, Roxana and Jay, for presenting this information. I'm sure it's a very difficult process to go through. Seems to be a lot of reallocation of funds, which I can only imagine means that there's cuts elsewhere that are funding these. So I thank you for finding the money to move into or put the expenses somewhere else. So thank you very much. I want to thank you for your time and for coming back a second time to do this. All right, thank you very much, everybody, and we'll move on to item number 2. Okay, so we're now on item number 2.2, which is going to be presented by Claire Sheffield, supported by Conan, and we're going to have a presentation on the unidentified IEP data.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. Just give me a second. All right, so let me just get to the beginning. Sorry about that. Let me see if I can do this. All right, hi. So my name is Claire Sheffield, and I am an instructional program leader with Special Education Services. And one of my portfolios is Aspen Spec Ed, which is Halton's new IEP engine. And we're currently finishing up our second year of implementation and have started to dig deep into the data that we can collect from the tools within the program to help us better understand our special education students. And this presentation is just a snapshot of the data that we can collect through Aspen Spec Ed. So, to have an IEP in the Halton District School Board, students do not need to meet specific board or ministry criteria for an exceptionality. Rather, they must demonstrate a need to have an individualized education plan to support their learning. The total number of active IEPs in our board, and active means those IEPs which have been implemented and are in place, and not those that are currently being drafted, is 12,449. And this number represents the students who have been identified with an exceptionality through IPRC, as well as those who are not identified. And that number is constantly changing as IEPs are added and exited. So some students do meet board criteria to be identified with an exceptionality through IPRC. And this slide lists the categories of exceptionalities as defined by the Ministry of Education. And through data collection, we can determine the number of students who are identified in each of these categories. The Halton District School Board currently has 4,205 students who have been identified as exceptional through IPRC across all of these categories. And although the number of IEPs continues to change, the percentage of identified and non-identified students seems to remain similar. So in order to better understand and support our entire special education student population, we need to also recognize those students who meet board criteria for identification, but who choose not to go through the IPRC process, as well as our students who may have other special education needs that are not currently on the ministry's list of identifications. So in order to meet this need, we've created a diagnosis field on the IEP that allows us to pull and track data that has been inputted by special education resource teachers and self-contained teachers. It has been documented already in the OSR and in the assessment section of the IEP, but can't be collated. So currently, these are the diagnoses and exceptionalities that we're tracking in the diagnosis field. You'll notice that some of the fields are not official diagnoses, such as giftedness. But because the Ministry of Education identifies this as an exceptionality, we've decided to track the students who meet criteria for identification as well as diagnoses to better determine the number of students who choose not to go through the IPRC process. And you'll note there that no diagnosis is an option in the drop-down menu because it forces certs to complete all the fields instead of leaving them blank and therefore open to interpretation. So, how does this help inform our teaching? When students are identified through IPRC, their identification can be tracked for data purposes. For example, we can use Aspen Spec Ed to determine that there are 250 students with an identification of communicational autism. But because we can now track diagnoses and students who meet criteria for identification but who have not been identified through IPRC, we can also determine that there are currently 1,224 students who have a diagnosis of ASD, but who have not been formally identified with autism. And this gives us a better picture of the learning needs of our students across the board. We do need to keep in mind that with data collection, we have human error. and our data is dependent on the accuracy of the information inputted into the IEP. Another factor that would affect our data is, for example, we could have a student who has a diagnosis, but the school resource team has determined that an IEP is not necessary at this time. And therefore, this student and their diagnosis is not reflected in our data because our data is pulled directly from IEPs. So here's an example of the type of data that we can collect from the diagnosis field. This chart includes students with both identified and non-identified IEPs. As an example, we currently have 2,975 students who have a diagnosis of ADHD. We have 851 students who have diagnosed anxiety, and 51 students across the board with Down syndrome. And this is interesting data because, for example, Down syndrome isn't an identifiable exceptionality through IPRC. So it just sort of goes to show that collecting data through the diagnosis field gives us information about our student population that would be otherwise unavailable as a school board in that form. So in this chart, we break down the numbers of students who have met criteria for an exceptionality, but differentiate between those who've been identified through IPRC and those who haven't. And you can see in this chart that Halton has 861 students who've been identified with an exceptionality of communicational learning disability, for example, and 2,556 students who meet criteria for that same exceptionality, but who haven't been through the IPRC process for identification. Students who have academic needs may not have a diagnosis. School resource teams, including families, may decide to implement an IEP for various reasons, and this support is not reliant on diagnosis or identification of an exceptionality. And this chart shows the number of students who are identified through IPRC without any other diagnoses. That's the one that shows 1,932, as well as those students who have neither an exceptionality nor a diagnosis, but demonstrate the need for an individual education plan to support their learning. And I think I just heard a question.
You did, Kate Lambecker. I would really love to see how many of those no diagnosis folks are pending assessment. Could we separate that out between people who are not identified because they're on a waiting list for identification?
So I want to differentiate a little bit between identification and diagnosis. So a lot of our students in this chart, for example,
let's say pending assessment. Do we understand how many of these children without either any specific diagnosis or identification, obviously, which would be subsequent to diagnosis, how many of them do not have diagnosis because they are pending assessment?
Sure, they're either a doctor or through a psychologist or something, or a board psychologist for sure.
Correct.
That's not data that we collect on our IEP, and so therefore not something that we can track at this time. I'm not sure that that's something we can do, but at this point we don't track pending diagnoses.
I would, if it is possible, I think that's really important information for us to understand how many children are in this sort of unidentified area because they don't have the personal financial means for identification, they don't have a family physician, they're waiting on a board psychologist, some way to collect information where there are barriers happening. Those barriers are in effect invisible if we don't have the ability to say the block for these families and getting diagnosis or identification is in part because of access to service or waiting for diagnosis or identification. And I think it's essential that some way be determined to track those numbers.
Thanks, Kate. We can take that back and try to do some thinking around how we would access that information, as we don't always know it, and how we would correlate it to those in the no diagnosis field.
Aaron, you have a question.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just like on that same thread. Would it be possible for you to sort of impute, these kind of numbers in terms of? I would assume you have at least you'd have access to the data that shows what students are identified through board resources and what students are identified through private resources, like people, sometimes people go and get their own psych eds, done their own assessments with speech pathologists, etc. And I think all of that is just to show the gap in funding and resources that's available to be able to support what's needed. I don't know if that's possible.
So I'm happy to speak to that because I think that's kind of what we're trying to do with this. And if I look at this slide here, for example, we have our students who have non-identified IEPs, so they don't have to go through that IPRC process to have a specific identification of exceptionality in order to have an IEP. They can have a diagnosis through a doctor to get an IEP or have that support, or they may not even have a diagnosis, right? They may just need support. So we are able to filter that data through students who are identified and meet ministry criteria for an exceptionality, and those students who are diagnosed outside may not meet that exceptionality data or criteria. And if I slide back a little bit here, we're tracking all sorts of different diagnoses that would be made through a doctor, for example, but isn't assessed through a board psychologist, if that helps a little bit.
Kate, you had a question.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. So thank you, Erin, because I agree. And I believe that there is a real issue of economic equity that we are not flagging enough, because I know within our own parent community that there is a segment of parents who are able to afford private assessment, and there is a segment who cannot. And we have had parents who, my understanding is incorrectly, have been informed to go and get private assessment that they would have to pay for as a family. And I think understanding both the current percentage of diagnoses and identifications that come through private assessment, and I'm not talking about from a doctor or something that would be part of the public system in general, but through someone's ability to pay for proper diagnosis of their child, that not only do we need to understand the impact that is having on diagnoses today, but how that is changing over time, because at least within our own community, that is a major source of strife, where we have parents who can afford it and parents who can't, and it causes a lot of distress for the families who can't and feel that they're failing their children because they can't afford to be the parent that goes and gets a private assessment. I really believe it's an issue that we have to be aware of.
Thank you. So Colette, you said you'd take that back to the team and see what we can do to get some more data. Claire, did you want to continue?
Sure. Thank you so much. The diagnosis field also allows us to determine the co-occurrence of various diagnoses and exceptionalities. So, for example, approximately 30% of our students have either an identification of communicational learning disability or a diagnosis of a learning disability, also have a diagnosis of ADHD. The students represented in this bar graph include those who are either an identified or non-identified, have either an identified or non-identified IEP, and the numbers of those students who also have a diagnosis of anxiety. For example, the total number of students who have a learning disability in Halton, whether or not they've been identified through IPRC, equals 3,417. Of those 3,417 students, 172 of them also have a diagnosis of anxiety.
Can I just ask a question? Those numbers seem very low for the comorbid anxiety. The typical numbers for ADHD and anxiety would range between 40% and 73%, I think, is for girls with a diagnosis of ADHD comorbid with anxiety. So I wonder whether they're either not going that extra stage, or I just wonder why that number would be so low.
I think it's a great question, and I think part of that is that we are the only data that gets put into the IEP, the diagnosis field, is that is already in the OSR. So a parent may say, my student or my child has anxiety, but unless we have documentation, we're asking CERTs not to put anything down in the IEP unless that's actual information that just helps us with validity. And I wonder, I think that's part of our next steps, is learning how we can gather more information for our students and about our students.
Yeah, it also might relate to the stigma that comes with mental illness.
I think there's lots to learn, and my next slide is actually those next steps exactly, right? So looking at using the tools in Aspen Spec Ed, and specifically the diagnosis field, to help us gather more data in greater detail. And so with that information, we can engage further with the research department to better understand how it can be used in conjunction with achievement data and census data. Really work to reduce that human error and increase validity of the data that we're collecting. And finally, the analysis of the data that we continue to gather will help us develop future goals around supporting all of our special education students. So like I said, this is a snapshot of the information that we can gather, and now that we can get it, what can we do with it? It's very exciting information to help us better support our students.
Does anyone have any questions? I'd like to just comment about how wonderful it is to be able to finally see what some of those unidentified IEPs are all about. It is absolutely critical as we try and work out special education needs and budgets and, you know, those kind of resources, and where we as a team should be focusing our attention, and the school board should be focusing its attention. Without that data, it's almost impossible to do. So thank you so much for the effort that's taken place. Does anybody have any questions? No? Okay, well, thank you so much. There's been some great suggestions tonight of additional information that we could collect, and I do agree that equity is a big piece of special education, so whatever we can do to support families in finding out how best to support their children will be wonderful. Thank you very much, and we're now going to move on to our final action item of this evening. Thank you, Claire. So we're now going to have a brief presentation on the special education plan for 2024-2025.
All right, thank you. So we did distribute the special education plan, I think about 3 weeks ago, so that you would have time to dig into it, to review it, to gather your thoughts and questions. I will give you a few highlights, but then I would certainly want to open it up for any feedback and any questions you may have. And I'd like to start by thanking SEAC. This has been a particularly challenging year with really deliberating our budget challenges and facing how do we maintain our programs and supports for our students while meeting the fiscal responsibilities of the school board. And so I do appreciate the conversations that we've had over the many months and certainly all of your input that's gone into the plan that's before you tonight. So a few significant updates, and really nothing in the plan is new information. It is all information that has been touched on over the last many months as we've talked about the budget challenges and efficiencies. But I will just highlight them. So the behavior resource classroom, if you recall, we had Vice Principal Farrell Bangirder come to us back in, I think it was March or February, to talk about how we can better support our students with behaviors, focusing on the supports within the homeschool, building the capacity of our teachers and educators in the homeschool rather than sending our students with behaviors to a BRC or a behavior resource classroom. And to that end, the demand for those classes has greatly reduced over the last number of years. And even in year. So in year, we have closed 2 classes due to low enrollment. We are closing a 3rd class at the end of this school year as the students finish their 2-year intervention. And we have 1 class that remains open because the students are entering year 2 of the 2-year intervention. But at the end of next year, that class will close, and the BRC has therefore been removed from the special education plan as a placement option. And in turn, we're investing in those itinerant supports where we can go in and work alongside the staff in a school to do job embedded learning and build the capacity of the staff to support the range of needs of learners. So we're adding a specialized behavior support worker to our current complement of 8, so that will make 9, as well as increasing our itinerant team of educational assistants who have specialized skills in supporting the range of student needs. They are called our MDST EAs. And so with these 2 resources combined, along with our instructional program leaders, we'll be supporting students with behaviors in their home schools. Structured reading is another success story that we've talked about over the course of this year. We began the implementation of the Right to Read recommendations, in fact, before those recommendations were released, with the development of the Structured Reading Instructional Resource Teaching Team. And that's a team currently of 8 teachers that provide direct intervention to students across all of our schools. But certainly a few years into this intervention, we knew that this really was, the students would be better served by the staff in schools. And so we started 2 years ago training all of our special education resource teachers to deliver Wilson to their own students, and have really invested very deeply in that learning. And now we're ready to shift from our central team providing that direct service to students to a coaching model. So we're folding the structured reading instructional resource teachers, but adding an instructional program leader to lead this work and to maintain the investments and the growth that we've experienced over the last number of years in this area, as well as 3 structured reading coaches. And so those coaches will work directly with staff in schools to maintain and to grow our experiences and our expertise in this area. In terms of our class sizes, that was touched on in the budget presentation. Resizing our classes was one of the suggestions that came out of the consultation process with SEAC, and so the plan does reflect resized ARC, or what we currently call our LD classes, but soon to call our academic resource classrooms, as well as our community pathway programs, to a class size of approximately 10 and 12 respectively. So as we heard from Superintendent Ngoy, that our funding the funding benchmark is 16 students in the classroom. So we are still below that benchmark, but have found some efficiencies through that resizing. So in particular with the community pathway program, with a resizing to an average of 12, that was a reduction of 8 full-time equivalent staff across our 7 sites. Our ARC classes, they initially resulted in a reduction of 12 classes across all of the system. We have 35 classes this year. We've recently added a class to Milton, so it's in fact a reduction of 11, given that as school resource team recommendations are coming through and students going through IPRC, we did find that we needed to add a class in Milton. Just a kind of a hypothesis around such a significant reduction is our implementation of the multi-tiered system of support across all of our classrooms, and the implementation of Wilson as a Tier 3, but also we're using the structured reading Wilson resources as a Tier 1 and Tier 2 resource. And so we have found that the demand for the academic resource classrooms this year has also dropped. So it was really a combination of those two measures, the resizing and the requests coming through a school resource team. Our self-contained gifted programs, we are closing 2 junior intermediate classes in Halton Hills. They were running at approximately a 30% enrollment. So it was, they had 7 and 8 students in each of the classes. We did offer the students that are currently in those programs to cluster together and remain at their current site, or to attend the self-contained gifted program in Milton. We did initially anticipate a reduction of 2 classes in Oakville, but in fact, the demand for the gifted program in Oakville is increasing, and we've added 2 and are likely adding a 3rd class in order to comply with the ministry class sizes there. So certainly a demand for a gifted in Oakville is on the rise. Our structured reading IRTs I've already spoken about, and the GLE, GLS, I think we spoke to that already in the budget presentation around that simply being a kind of a shifting of where that money lives versus in human resources versus special education, although the credit offerings remain unchanged. So those were the significant changes that are reflected in our class sizes, both in terms of the number of classes as well as the class sizes. For Kelp and Alpha, the class sizes have remained unchanged, although we do have a reduction of 1 Alpha class, and that's simply based on the demand for the class. Our Community Pathway Elementary, or currently called our Life Skills classes, that remains unchanged, both in terms of class size and in terms of the number of classes that we are offering. And a noteworthy stabilized support, and this is really based on strong feedback from all of our stakeholders, including SEAC. The number of educational assistants remains stable, as well as the number of student supervisors. So those are our supervisors during a nutrition break for our students with special education needs. So those 2 pieces remain stable. And at this point, I'd like to open it up to questions, comments, and any feedback you might have.
Does anybody have any questions? Sophia.
Hi there. Thank you for that. That sounds like some great things are happening. Just had a couple of questions. You mentioned the Wilson Reading Program in a response to the ministry report, which is wonderful. I'm just wondering, I brought this up previously, but wondering about how that's looking in CPP classes, because I know I've spoken to staff in CPP programs in different schools, and many of them are feeling unsupported when it comes to teaching reading. A lot of the kids in CPP are really at an elementary level and need that type of support, but the teachers don't have the resources. So how are we helping them with the resources? 1, do they have the Wilson resources? 2, have they had any training? How are we supporting them with the program?
Great question, Sophia. And if you don't mind, I'm going to turn it over to Conan to respond to that.
Yeah, good question. We're actually going to be rolling out in the fall a program called Readtopia, which we'll talk more about in the fall, but it is a specific program for our CPP classes. We feel that in terms of many of the students who are in CPP, some Wilson is very applicable to them and some it is not. And we felt that, we want to make sure that they're serviced properly in terms of where we can meet them at with their reading levels. So we are looking at this program of Readtopia. We are just going through the final stages of approval and then training of staff and implementation in the fall with that program. But we'll talk more about that again in the fall.
And
Okay,
Connor, do you want to speak about the Wilson training that's happening for our secondary schools right now?
Yeah, thank you, Colette. Yeah, the piece that we're doing right now is we are doing more extensive training for Wilson, for secondary and elementary as well, but with a focus on secondary. So at the end of May, we are going to bring on every high school on board. So all high schools will have full staff that are Wilson, or so not all staff, spec ed staff that are Wilson trained. It's a 3-day training module that we're doing at the end of the month. So all schools will be online in terms of Wilson rollout in the fall as well, too.
Great, thank you. Kate.
Yes, two things. First, do we have a sense of how many of the Milton, the currently enrolled Milton's gifted self-contained have elected to do the partially integrated versus just return to their home schools? Do we know those numbers yet?
Sorry, are you referring to Halton Hills?
Yes. Or in North Burlington, do we know how many have elected with the classroom closures to do the clustering versus withdraw to their home schools? Do you have those numbers yet?
If I recall correctly, but don't quote me, Kate.
Sure. No, I don't mean exact. I just want to have the sense if it was successful, like if that offer was a successful option for those families.
So there were 15 students in total impacted. 5 of those students are moving on to grade 9.
Okay.
2 students opted for the self-contained class in Milton, and the remaining 8 students opted to cluster at their current school, if I recall correctly.
Okay, great, thank you. And the second is related to the closure of the behavioral classrooms, and is something I brought up when we first talked about this a few months ago. And I would like to know if there is a plan to monitor for whether the move to home classrooms for some of the children who would have in the past been in a behavioral classroom, whether they are losing school hours through being sent home or otherwise being removed from the classroom in this setting. I would like to know if there's a plan to understand that impact and the impact on both the classroom and on the student, especially pulling out, just because I know that that can happen where a child is asked to leave school early or does not attend full time when they're not able to thrive successfully in the classroom. And and it's due to, friends who've had this happen to them, that I have a concern that, are we going to make sure that these children are attending full time and getting their full education in their home classroom as they're removed from these behavioral classroom placements?
Thanks for that, Kate. That is definitely a strong focus of our work right now, and both from a special education perspective as well as Safe Schools, because Safe Schools ultimately manages what we call our school exclusions. And so when we look at shortening a student's day or having them picked up early, it is tantamount to a school exclusion. And so we have been working closely with our Safe Schools department to really bring some focus and expectations around our students being in school full time, and really building the capacity of our staff to support the learners for the school day. So you're touching on something that's been really quite important to us, and it certainly will remain a focus of our work moving forward.
Do we have stats on that can allow, obviously anonymously, to us to track how many students are impacted by exclusions and how significant those exclusions are? Because clearly a couple of afternoons in a school year is not a thing that we have a big concern about. But if someone is at a point where they almost never complete a school day, that is a thing that we need to understand that's happening and how many students it impacts. Do we have those numbers?
That hasn't been something that we have been tracking, but it is something that we're talking about with Safe Schools around the need for that tracking. So it is something that we're talking about.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Sophia.
Hi there. I'm so sorry. I think I lost connection when my question was being answered. You mentioned that the Wilson training is coming up at the end of May for all CPP teachers.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear
Not
you now.
specifically CPP teachers, because we are looking at a program called Retopia, which will roll out
Right.
more, and that
In
the
the fall.
training will be, for the CPP teachers will be focused more on that. There could
Right.
potentially be some CPP teachers that are sent for the training. It's
Okay.
more of a looking at more like the spec ed team and the resource team in terms of the high schools who will be training and getting that, receiving that training to support. So even if there was a child who would benefit from doing Wilson in the class, it would be looking more from the spec ed team, not necessarily from the CPP teacher. But like I said, we're looking more at Retopia as the option.
Yeah, no, I understand. I guess my concern is like I brought the Wilson issue up, almost 2 years ago. And at that time we were rolling it out and the resources were ordered. I just feel like we're 2 years later now and, not even all elementary teachers have resources in hand in classrooms from what I'm hearing from parents. So it's just that, time for us is so, it's just, it's running out and our kids are missing that. So like now this is the first time hearing of Retopia. So, by the time it rolls out and teachers get resources in hand, like that's a lot of missed time for the kids. So, I mean, the teachers then, the spec ed department has to request to go to these trainings that you're like, I'm thinking of CPP certs in the building. Do they need to request to go to Wilson training just so they have something right now in hand? Or is that going to come to them automatically? Are they released for the day? How's that going to work?
Yeah, it's basically site specific. So we're offering the training. There's an expectation that all high schools come online, and they will be sending teams, and they're picking the staff members who would be the ones who'd be implementing that. So it depends on the high school and really is site specific.
I see. Okay, awesome. Thank you. I had one more question. The class cap sizes that were discussed earlier. Is that something we're looking at to happen in September?
Yes.
So we're looking at an average of about 12 in CPP classes?
Yes, so it's staffed at an average of 12, but the principal and the school team will build the classes based on profiles of students. And so they have the flexibility to build up to 16 and then some classes lower. So it's just the staffing is at 12, an average of 12.
I see.
So
okay,
and previously it was an average of 10 for ESC
Right.
and 12 for CSC. So it's just a very small increase on the ESC side, but ultimately principals will make decisions around who are these learners and are they more suitable in a larger class or a smaller class.
Right, but generally they shouldn't exceed 12, is what you're saying. Like for the most part, or you're saying they're staffed for an average of 12.
And they're staffed at an average of 12. But
Right.
so, for example, our students in community pathways, our students in CSC.
Sorry, remind me what CSC stands for again.
Oh my gosh, I was worried you're going to ask me that. Community Skills Certificate.
Okay.
They, are quite independent. They're doing co-op placements in the community. So those classes are likely to be built closer to the 16.
Right.
And our students who are very complex, medically fragile, they might be built into classes smaller. So it really depends on the clustering of students and how that team is going to use the resources that they're given within this range. Maximum 16, that's the cap. But how we staff it is an average of 12.
Okay, and you think that's not a significant change from what it was previously?
No, it's not a significant change.
Okay, got it. And sorry, last question. Recently a parent reached out and mentioned something about, I know the track and field day was hugely popular in elementary, the special education, special athletes. It's an amazing, in fact, the Peel board would love to emulate that, and people have asked me questions about it. It's amazing, and I know a lot of our families look forward to that every year. So it's interesting. I sort of assume that a similar thing happens in high school, but I've connected with different parents from different high schools and CPP programs, and what they've said is the CPP programs staff are left to sort of organize their own, but they're not supported by the board in organizing something. So just wondering is that something we can look at doing? Because I know it's hugely successful, the one that we do that is for the younger kids. And would there ever be an option to combine to go from maybe K to 12, like a a model that includes the high school kids in that. Has that ever been something that's come up or been discussed?
Yeah, thanks for that, Sophia. I'm not sure that it's been discussed. It hasn't been discussed in my time. And Colin's time is even shorter. So I know that our high schools work with what's the organization that did our day at the Velodrome? The Ontario Special Olympics. So our secondary schools do a lot of athletic activities, including track and field, through that organization. But we can certainly work with our CPP programs to see if there's an interest in doing a board-wide event.
Yeah, that'd be amazing. Or even to have them like included. Like I just think our program that the track and field that's run for the elementary kids is so successful, and it's such a well-oiled machine because you guys have done it for so many years. It would be so amazing to have the high school kids join or be a part of that, if possible. But just I was wondering if that's ever been thought of or brought up. But that's certainly something. Is there somebody that I can get in touch with to help bring that up, or?
So Claire, who was on doing the presentation around the unidentified data, she's one of the organizers of the special athletic track meet. So we can certainly put you in touch with Claire and get the ball rolling in terms of a conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Great. So at this point, are there any more questions regarding the special education plan at this point in time? Okay, so the plan will go back and will be presented next month for each association and member to vote on their support or not for the plan. So just to give you time to review again, but that will come back for your comment or for your formal declaration of support or not next month. Okay, at this time, we are now going to move on to the SEAC discussion and question period. Is there any specific questions that anybody would like to raise at this point in time? Okay, we have had quite a good discussion this evening, so that makes sense. So we'll now move on to item 4.0, communications to SEAC, and we'll start with the superintendent's report.
Thank you. So you have the report, so I won't go through it in great detail. But Sophia's already touched on one of the things that's coming up that is of great pride for us, and that's the Special Athletic Track Meet. It's a slight change in name because we've always called it the Special Athletes Track Meet, but we're looking at building more inclusive language. And so it is the Special Athletic Track Meet now. That's coming up on June 14th at Garth Webb Secondary School. And we certainly invite SEAC to be a part of that. If you're interested, just reach out to Laura and we can get you the details and how to check in and identify you as a visitor. It's an amazing day, as Sophia has described, and a great way to kind of see our kids truly shine. So we've been working on our summer learning offerings. Unfortunately, the ministry released the details and the funding very late, just in the last couple of weeks. So we're quite frantically gathering all of the plans that are detailed in that report and rolling all of the information out to our schools and getting all of those pieces organized as summer is coming up very quickly. The co-op employer recruitment has shifted a little bit. We didn't get a great response for holding an in-person event, so it has flipped to a virtual event. And this is a fair with the goal to recruit employers that are interested in co-op students with special education needs and working with them to dispel some of the myths around students with disabilities and what kinds of things they could do in co-op placements. So that is happening next week. And I linked in the Director's Cut episode around learning and achievement that has a focus on our Project Search program, which is a co-op placement for some of our students in their final year of a CPP. We're incredibly proud of this project and the successes that have come out of it. Sadly, we're losing our longtime partner, Community Living Oakville, as they weren't able to secure the grant that funds the 2 skills trainers that have been a part of that program since its inception. So I do want to acknowledge both Mike and Megan, who have been really instrumental in not only the success of our students, but really creating really strong foundations for that program. And we know that our own staff, so the program will be staffed by a teacher and now educational assistants rather than the skills trainers, but they've walked into a really great foundation that they'll be able to carry on. So we thank Mike and Megan for their wisdom and passion, as well as that partnership that we've really benefited from Community Living Oakville, sorry. And happy to take any questions.
Are there any questions? Okay, so I'm going to move on to item 4.2, association reports. Does any association have anything they'd like to share with SEAC at this point? Jennifer.
You know, I always have something to share. So let's see what we have this week. I mentioned last month about the one-to-one summer support worker reimbursement fund. And the application for that is open until the end of May. So again, there is the maximum reimbursement of $600, and it's a random selection from anybody who registers. So there's still time. Also, Autism Ontario was recently on the agenda with Steve Paikin, and you can go and watch the entire episode on YouTube. It takes a look at autism policy, inclusion, and human rights. Autism Ontario also has some upcoming series on promoting the mental health of autistic people living in rural and remote communities. It's 3 parts, one for people with autism, one for caregivers, and one for community professionals. And finally, May 6th, the registration opened, so it may already be full, but we can still go and double check. And it's Making the Feel Better box. For school-age children with anxiety and autism. And we were looking at the co-occurring diagnoses earlier. So this would be really good for autistic children ages 6 to 12, the families, caregivers, and professionals working with this population to build a feel better box of tools to help with anxiety. And the registration for that is all on the Autism Ontario website.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. Sophia.
Thank you.
Sophia, I saw your hand up.
Yes, I just wanted to share the annual Halton Walk for Down Syndrome will be coming up on June the 8th at the Milton Fairgrounds. This is a huge event for us where we raise lots of funds. It's a great day for families to come on out and walk and celebrate our kids. This year we have quite a large vendor market happening. Lots of exciting things. So I thought I'd share and extend the invitation to SEAC to come join us if you're available.
Sounds wonderful. Any other association reports? Erin.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to say that Voice is very excited that within a matter of days, we're going to be opening up registration for our annual family camp, which is going to be, it was typically held in the summer. We struggled finding a location since COVID. Because of COVID, the place that we used to always go during the summer has shut down. And so trying to find an alternative has been a challenge. But so we're having a kind of a late summer family camp, the weekend of September 13, it's the Friday. So 13, 14, and 15th is going to be our annual summer family camp. And like I said, registration is open. This is kind of the foundational and marquee event on the calendar for Voice for a long time for a lot of families. It allows all of our kids and all of the parents to get together with one another. And it's very transformational for our kids, honestly, to be able to spend that kind of long, that long period of time, 2 full days with each other. So we're pretty excited that, after having been shut down for 4 years because of COVID, we're finally getting it back on track. I was hoping that registration would be open by now and I could announce that, but we're not quite there yet. But I'll circulate it to our itinerant teachers when we're all ready to go, and we're welcome to new and old voice families alike. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Any other associations? Well, I'll quickly add then that the Centre for Diverse Learners has its youth summer program open. It's a program focused on neurodivergent youth and from the ages of 14 plus, looking at relationships, consent, getting involved in conversations, how to enter and exit conversations. So if there are youth that are struggling with some of these social skills, please go to the Diverse Learners website and you can register there. Okay, we're now going to move on to item 4.3, which is the trustees report.
Sorry, just took me a second to unmute. Good evening, everyone. Just a quick update from trustees. As we've mentioned previously, there is a big project underway this school year and next to develop the next multi-year strategic plan for the Halton District School Board. The work that's underway right now is the consultation process with staff, student, parents, and community members. So I just wanted to mention, if you're not aware, there is a town hall event coming up that is virtual on May 28th. I'm thinking I could probably send along the link for registration to that. It is a facilitated small table group conversation for participants to get together and talk about ideas around the multi-year plan. Superintendent Reddick, I saw you raise your hand. I'm just wondering, does SEAC have their own opportunity to participate in this process coming up?
Yes, thank you. Ember is the facilitator organization, and they are coming to our next SEAC meeting, and they're going to spend about 45 minutes doing a facilitated dialogue to get SEAC's input. So thank you, Trustee Baxter.
Fantastic. I'm so happy to hear that. I was hoping that SEAC would have an opportunity, but I wasn't sure given the time of year. If there are any committee members who are unable to make the next meeting, I guess that's the first week of June, correct? Perhaps we could provide that information to sign up and attend the virtual town hall that's on May 28th. Additionally, there will be a survey going out to all community members, parents, students, and staff too. So there's many opportunities to provide feedback through the consultant Ember experience. So we're very excited. It's a big project, and it really assists to hear from as many people as possible. So we'd ask kindly that you participate in any way that you can, and it sounds like there's many different ways of participating. So hopefully something, one of those many options will work for everyone. And that's it for trustees. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you very much. We'll move on to item 4.4 then, which is committee reports. Is there anything at this time from the Accessibility and Coordinating Committee, Evelyn? I don't know if Evelyn's here. Okay. I assume that there's nothing right now. Is there anything then, Kate, from the Mental Health and Wellbeing Strategy Steering and Advisory Committee?
Yes, and I apologize. I missed the last couple of meetings due to a prolonged illness, and so I have a few meetings to update you on. So the March meeting, we saw the anti-bullying strategy, which I think got presented to you last month, which at the meeting I also missed. The Mental Health Advisory Committee we had some opportunity to discuss the challenges of balancing having that kind of a strategy while understanding the impact that there may be some behavioral needs at play in some of the instances of bullying, and how challenging it can be for teachers in particular to manage their understanding and meeting all of the people involved in incidences and challenges in the classroom, and what is often a lot of pressure on them for punishment, which is not the role of the school. Again, I don't know how much of this was covered last week or last month. I apologize, since I had to miss that meeting. But I think it was a good opportunity for some of the teachers and other people there on that committee to express that pull that they feel and the pressure that they often feel to punish rather than manage behavior in that situation when they don't. That isn't their job to be the jury and sort of conviction system in a bullying strategy. It's about resolving and preventing issues in the school. And so I don't know how well this played with what was presented to you last month, but those were the sorts of things we discussed in the March meeting. And then the meeting this month, we had an opportunity to consult on the multi-year plan. Thank you, Carol. And they were looking specifically for input on what the teachers, the child and youth workers, the students really felt were the main issues at play around the issues of mental health that needed to be brought into the multi-year plan. One of the things that was very prominent were the significant number of children presenting with anxiety specifically, and the way that has been escalating in terms of what the child and youth workers and social workers are seeing in the school population. And I think that's really interesting to contrast with the fact that we're seeing that anxiety isn't being formally identified unless a medical diagnosis is actively presented by parents to staff. And yet what we're seeing is the teachers, the child youth workers, the social workers are saying they're seeing a significant escalation in anxiety and a need to find ways to help students manage anxiety in their lives and in the classroom. And that's, I think, potentially hard to do if we're not actually tracking those numbers properly, because we require a medical diagnosis in order to get that kind of identification. Another thing that was brought up was the dependence that a lot of children are having on their cell phones to manage their feelings of emotional stress, loneliness, and so on, and how that is going to play with the new regulations coming in around cell phone use in the classroom and the impact that is likely to happen on children who are quite dependent on these devices. Some of them for their mental health, where, if they're feeling isolated or alone in a classroom, they have the comfort of their phone as something to distract them or make them feel less alone in the classroom. And we may see a real impact on these children depending on how the rollout happens with the restrictions on cell phone use. That's everything from me. Any questions?
I think that's extremely important information, Kate. I mean, I totally agree. It could have quite a negative impact, this rollout, on some of our special education kids. So, as you say, it'll be interesting to see what happens. Does anybody have any questions for Kate at this time? No? Okay. We've got one final item that we're at item 5.0, which is our next agenda or order item, but one thing that I kind of missed was just the SEAC hybrid meeting dates were sent out to you. And we currently have the dates set for next year. We don't think there's any concern with them, but there may be a situation where some of our dates have to move to a Wednesday, depending on how the Board of Trustees organize their board meetings. But does anybody have any issues with the dates of anything we've missed in terms of celebrations or important dates with the proposed 2024 dates as they're listed. No, okay. Well, we're going to see how the Board of Trustees work out with their meetings, and then we'll may well come back to SEAC if there need to be some adjustment from us to be able to accommodate the trustees. So, as Colette mentioned, next month we have the multi-year plan, and we're going to be doing some work on that. That will be our final meeting of the school year, which is quite hard to believe, but we're there already. So, if anybody does have any things that they think of over the next little while that they'd like to add to our list of agenda items, please do feel free to reach out, and we'll add them there. So at this point in time, we have completed our agenda, and at, I think it's 8:38, move to adjourn. Thank you.